Joe Biden once called Saudi Arabia a pariah and swore he would make the country pay for Jamal Khashoggi's murder. But after seeing proof that Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman ordered the assassination, why has the U.S. president backtracked on holding the kingdom to account? I'm Andrea Sankey, and today's newsmaker is the U.S. refusal to sanction the Saudi Crown Prince. Well, the brutal murder of journalist Jamal Khashoggi inside Istanbul's Saudi consulate was secretly recorded by Turkish intelligence. That evidence would help prove the full complicity of Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman. But no action has been taken against the kingdom's de facto leader, despite detailed investigations by the United Nations and U.S. intelligence agencies confirming he ordered the killing. So why have the world's leading democracies allowed Mohammed bin Salman to get away with murder? Baroness Helena Kennedy is the member of the United Nations team that investigated Jamal Khashoggi's murder, and she joins us now from London. Baroness Kennedy, thank you so much for being with us. Some 2 years ago, you were one of the very few people to actually hear the recordings of Jamal Khashoggi's murder in full. Has the horror, as you described it yourself, has that worn off, or are you still shocked by what you heard?
I remain shocked by what I heard, because it was so brutal, and the cruelty of it was really beyond imagining. Because you heard the voice of someone coming into the consulate, thinking he was there for the receipt of papers for his marriage. And then suddenly becoming aware that a much more frightening proposition was in front of him, and you can hear him, his rising fear, his rising panic, his terror, and then you hear him being killed.
Right. And at the time, you know, President Trump was in office in the United States, and he was the closest Mohammed bin Salman could really get to having a best friend in the White House. So there was, of course, concern in Saudi circles especially that a Biden administration would provide the opposite effect. Has it?
Well, it's done a number of things. It has placed in the public domain what President Trump had not been willing to place in the public domain, which was the CIA's appraisal of this. And you'll remember that Gina Haspel had gone to your capital, to the capital, and to Ankara, and had met with senior intelligence, and she too heard all that I heard. And she had, with the other intelligence agencies, had reached the conclusion very clearly that this was an organized, extrajudicial killing. It was like the mafia. It was taking out your enemy. And that was what was done, and it was done from the highest authority, and all the evidence pointed to that. And that was the conclusion that we came to as well.
Right, but what we've seen now from a new Biden administration in response to now indisputable intelligence that says who was responsible really for carrying out this assassination, are you pleased with how the administration, the action the administration has taken?
I'm of course disappointed as an international lawyer. I'm the same sort of punishment responsible for a murder, that impunity is being granted to someone. He should be placed on the same lists as the other names of persons who were involved in this killing. Because the United States has created a long list of Saudi Arabian personnel who should not be allowed into the United States, and whose assets in the United States have been frozen. And we've done the same thing here in Britain, and those people on Interpol lists. But we have frozen the assets of people. But as with the United States, the remains outside of that list. And I regret that very much indeed. I can understand that at the moment, the president wants to seek some sort of resolution to the humanitarian crisis in the Yemen, where many, many children and citizens are dying as a result of that conflict. And I think he wants to be able to keep the doors open to negotiate that. And for that reason, does not want to add the Crown Prince to the list of those on the to see him. And I've got a message for him, and I give it to him on your television program. He really should be advised not to travel, because universal jurisdiction applies to people who commit crimes of this sort. An extrajudicial killing is of the most grievous kind of international crime, and there is universal jurisdiction, so he can go anywhere and be arrested if that country decides to arrest him. So he should be very cautious about his well-being, and don't travel to Davos this time, because it just might be that you're not as safe as you think you are.
We'll see if anyone is brave enough to take those steps, if he actually does venture out of Saudi Arabia. Baroness, unfortunately, we're having such audio problems with your connection. I just want to get one last question in, and hopefully you can answer this. There is suspicion, of course, that the release of the Saudi women's activist, Loujain al-Hathloul, from prison was a sort of, peace offering, in a sense, to Joe Biden's administration in exchange for going easy on Mohammed bin Salman for Khashoggi's murder. Do you see that as potentially the case, or do you worry that that is the case?
Well, I certainly think that the Crown Prince is regularly presenting to the world cosmetic suggestions that he's modernizing and behaving himself. But the release of Loujain was not enough. There remains in prison a whole number of women who were campaigning for equal rights for women. There are a whole number of people who are dissidents, who've been critics of his regime. There are a number of people who are family members whom he wanted to take out of circulation and who are incarcerated too. So we mustn't be deceived by these gestures, because I'm afraid they are empty gestures. And Loujain, for example, is still under a sort of house arrest where she's not allowed to travel for the next 5 years. So we mustn't be deceived by these gestures. It's gesture politics. He is not abiding by the rule of law, and he is committing incredible crimes against the world order.
Baroness Kennedy, we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you so much for taking the time to be with us here on the Newsmakers. We appreciate it. Now, of course, many expected that damning U.S. intelligence report to be followed by serious punitive action. Instead, eerily reminiscent of the former Trump administration, the Biden White House says it's being pragmatic and doesn't want to rupture its important relationship with Riyadh. But what's the real cost of sparing the Crown Prince? I'll ask our panel that in just a minute. But first, here's a look at the changing language coming from the White House over the killing of Jamal Khashoggi.
We're going to find out. We're going to find out who knew what, when, and where. And we'll figure it out. The cover-up was horrible. The execution was horrible. But they should have never been at an execution or a cover-up, because it should have never happened.
Khashoggi was, in fact, murdered and dismembered, and I believe in the order of the Crown Prince. And I would make it very clear, we were not going to, in fact, sell more weapons to them. We were going to, in fact, make them pay the price and make them, in fact, the pariah that they are.
We have made crystal clear, and will continue to do so, that the brutal killing of Jamal Khashoggi 28 months ago remains unacceptable conduct. At the same time, our relationship with Saudi Arabia is important. It's important to U.S. interests, and it requires continued progress and reforms to ensure that this important partnership rests on strong fundamentals and continues to advance our shared objectives in the Middle East.
Okay, let's get straight to our panel now, all from Washington, D.C., starting with Annelle Sheline. She is a research fellow with the Middle East program at the Quincy Institute. Ali Al-Ahmed is director of the Institute for Gulf Affairs, and Giorgio Cafiero is the founder and CEO of Gulf State Analytics. Thanks all so much for joining us. Annelle, we just heard Ned Price there saying the murder of Jamal Khashoggi is unacceptable, but we have to accept it because the relationship is that important. Can the U.S. have it both ways?
Well, I think in general, it is understandable, as you've already said, why Biden made this decision. I think it's also significant the U.S. recently released new sanctions against Russia as a result of the attempted poisoning of Alexei Navalny, but did not sanction Putin. So again, it's not so surprising that the U.S., the Biden administration, decided not to sanction the de facto head of state. Again, as has already been mentioned, there are additional considerations here in terms of the need to get Saudi Arabia to stop bombing Yemen and military involvement there, and the hoped for restarting negotiations with Iran, which hopefully will happen soon if Biden can manage to stop sending airstrikes into the Middle East. But again, it's not terribly surprising, I think, that this is what occurred. And I do think that the U.S. in general needs to completely reconsider its relationship with Saudi Arabia. The dysfunction of the U.S.-Saudi relationship extends far, far beyond Trump himself or Mohammed bin Salman himself. This has long been a dysfunctional relationship that historically was predicated on U.S. dependence on Saudi oil. And now that that is no longer the case, the U.S. really should fundamentally shift away from supporting this despotic regime. But I do think there's been somewhat of a loss of perspective by focusing so much on this one individual who was brutally and tragically murdered, and this notion of, well, we have to sanction Mohammed bin Salman. And I think part of what motivates that is this sort of idea that someone other than Mohammed bin Salman would be better. And I just want to push back against that because, Saudi Arabia, as I said, has been problematic for years. There's not some liberal democratic figure waiting in the wings to take over from MBS. And so this notion that another Saudi royal, a member of the House of Saud, taking over would somehow be far superior, more desirable, I don't think that's the case. And furthermore, the U.S. needs to get out of this notion that regime change is a useful policy or that Biden can somehow push Mohammed bin Salman aside. He is very powerful. He's consolidated power in himself. He's likely to be the king for the coming decades.
Okay.
And I think this reflects strategic thinking on the Biden administration's part, unfortunate as it is.
Fair enough. Ali, let me ask you, I know you are no fan of Mohammed bin Salman, but would you accept the argument that very bad could potentially get much worse under a different leadership in Saudi Arabia?
I agree with Dr. Annelle here. The fact that it's not MBS, a Saudi clan, it was not bad only after Khashoggi murder. It has been bad for decades. So I think what the Biden administration, and in particular the English government, they need to think outside the box and think that there is an alternative to the Saudi clan. That so far the Western thinking is the only horse here is the Saudi horse. In other countries, the future relationship between countries should not be limited to one group. The American administration for 6 decades only thought there is only one sole player, is the Saudi ruling family. What has changed, though, in the past few years is the Americans had access to the Saudi palace from different gates. Right now, there is only one gate, that is Mohammed bin Salman, because Mohammed bin Salman made sure all the other gates are locked and he put cement on them. So I think that's the genesis and the reason, and the main reason why the Biden administration wants to put pressure on MBS. The Khashoggi case is just the political football. The idea is they want to have more or greater access to the Saudi state. And Mohammed bin Salman is in the way.
Okay, Ali, I want to ask you something personally, though. You are living in exile. What would be your ideal situation for Saudi? I mean, so ideal that you could actually envision a safe return for yourself to the kingdom.
The Americans in 1776 built a republic and the ruins of a monarchy. It would be nice if the American policymakers, let other people do the same. It's not the job of the United States to change the regimes, around the world, but it's also not their right to defend these regimes. And the U.S. and the English government in London have been protecting the Saudi ruling family from its people for decades. And I can tell you that without a hint of hesitation. I was told this by a senior member of the Obama administration. Yes, we protect the Saudi government from people like you. People like me who wants, an elected government, remove the press, freedom of expression, and a national government. So the U.S. should just get out of the way and let the people of that country make their own choices, just like the Americans make their choice. And I think our people are more capable and more educated than the Americans of 1776. So it should be left to us, not to the Americans or the English or other people.
Okay.
This is a national decision.
I'm glad you have that faith. It gives some optimism going forward. But George, let me ask you to please explain how you think Mohammed bin Salman is an asset to Saudi Arabia.
Well, I mean, I think the fact of the matter right now is that Mohammed bin Salman has so much power in Saudi Arabia, regardless of what we may think about his style of leadership and the ways in which he's changed the kingdom. This has just certainly become a reality. I would add that I definitely agree with my two colleagues here in DC. Certainly agree to this point that it's very naive to think, though, that if Mohammed bin Salman were removed from the crown prince position, that Saudi Arabia would somehow become a state that would automatically begin acting in a way that maybe many people in Washington would consider to be good behavior. I mean, after all, it was before Mohammed bin Salman became the crown prince that the war in Yemen started. There was the execution of Sheikh al-Nimr before MBS became the crown prince. The Saudis were arming extremist groups in Syria before Mohammed bin Salman became the crown prince. So again, I'm not here to apologize for MBS, but I would just suggest that it's not so simple to say that if he were removed from the crown prince position, the country would, yeah.
I was trying to get at the issue, though, is why he actually can somewhat serve the better interest of the kingdom. Maybe I'll phrase it this way. Why does the king himself, with so many sons, so many brothers, so many nephews, feel so beholden specifically to Mohammed bin Salman, no matter how controversial? It is still the ultimate decision of the king. Why does he feel so strongly that MBS should stay in this position?
I'm not in King Salman's head. I don't know exactly what he's thinking, but what I will say is there are many people who make the argument that the Crown Prince is pushing certain changes within the kingdom in relation to Vision 2030 that many people see as the basis of stability and long-term prosperity in the kingdom. And there is an argument many people make that the successful transformation of Saudi Arabia into the post-hydrocarbon era will depend on Mohammed bin Salman and his vision. Okay. Certainly, this is something many of the defenders of the Crown Prince maintain.
Ali, would you think as well that, the king sees this specific son as at least more of a visionary than all the others that could have been in the running to become Crown Prince?
The relationship between Mohammed bin Salman and his father dates back early since his childhood, and I have some insiders who shared that information with me, that the relationship between them have been very close. Mohammed bin Salman is the first son of the King Salman's favorite wife, and he's been always close to his dad. And I think right now, as we speak, Mohammed bin Salman has developed this personality that he's very aggressive. He dominates people around him, but his father is unable, even if he wanted to remove him. His father is aging. His mental capacity is limited because of his dementia. So really, the king, the actual king, is Mohammed bin Salman. His father is just a figurehead that's unable to conduct any job. He doesn't really do any work, but he's there. And I think Mohammed bin Salman cleverly uses his father as a cover for things that people think it came from the king. The king cannot make decisions anymore. It is Mohammed bin Salman who is the conduit of the king's power. So I don't think king can remove him. It means Mohammed bin Salman will remove himself. I don't think that will happen. He actually enjoys right now the pressure from the United States, because that cements him as the only leader without any competition within the ruling family. He controls the military, the economy, and security apparatus. There is no chance of removing him, but the chance is to empower the people by ending the protection and support. The U.S. not only supported the Saudi war in Yemen, but supported also the Saudi war on dissidents and protesters, and called them terrorists instead of protesters.
Okay. Annelle, I can see you agree mostly with what you've heard. And I want to pick up on something you said in your first response, that the U.S., for example, or every country on the planet, for example, didn't think about sanctioning Putin himself, even though many believe he's responsible for the poisoning of Alexei Navalny. But what we heard from Baroness Kennedy, if you heard our earlier interview, she said the one thing that does come out of this is because the investigation into the killing of Jamal Khashoggi was so specific and really pointed to the criminal act of Mohammed bin Salman with evidence ordering this murder, she warned him, you better not travel. Be careful where you go outside Saudi, because international orders can come into effect and you could potentially be arrested. Do you think that is that's something pretty significant here, when it means that individual countries don't have to sanction MBS? Instead, international law can come into play, and it might be a lower court somewhere on the planet that decides to go after him and threatens him if he travels abroad.
That's entirely possible. I think there are a number of leaders in the Middle East who are deeply unpopular, who, people, I'm thinking of perhaps Bashar al-Assad in the future, if he leaves Syria or finds he may be a victim of sort of a extra legal assassination, given the level of outrage and anguish at the violence he's perpetuated against his own people. And he's not alone although perhaps in the magnitude he is alone. But so yes, it is possible that other countries or other actors, non-state actors, might take matters into their own hands. I just wanted to reaffirm what my colleague Ali said in terms of the need to think outside the box and think outside the House of Saud, and that the U.S. needs to stop propping up these dictators. And in fact, this is what Mohammed bin Salman himself has called for. He says he wants Saudi Arabia to be more independent. Vision 2030 he views as a means of getting off of dependence on oil, of granting greater prosperity to the people. This is part of why he remains popular, especially in the generation of young Saudis who spent their college years abroad, who are eager for their country to become normal. This notion of, the experiences that they had abroad, they would like that to be more possible in their country. And those sorts of changes are beginning to happen. As many have said, they remain somewhat superficial at this point, and much, much more needs to be done to actually transform Saudi society and allow it to take on this leadership role. But again, Biden can, in some ways, sort of kill Mohammed bin Salman with kindness, say, you know what, yes, we agree you should be more independent. We will stop selling you weapons. We will support your efforts at economic diversification, because getting the world off of Saudi oil is in the interest of every living thing on the planet in terms of trying to prevent the worst outcomes of climate change. And Mohammed bin Salman says he wants all of this. And so moving forward, I do at this point, although again, my hope is also that a sort of symptom or outcome of Vision 2030 would hopefully be eventually a more responsive and democratic government. Because, I mean, part of the reason we continue to see such centralized governments in the Middle East is because the state controls the main source of resources, which is oil production. And so moving forward, the hope is that a more broadly diversified economic system allows for greater sources of power and moving forward, the possibility of greater democracy. But at the moment, Mohammed bin Salman is the person that is making this transition, whereas previously the Saudi government power was more dispersed. Whereas now we see this one brutal, despotic figure who is making these changes.
Annelle, I'm sorry, I just want to get some final words from George in our last minute. I mean, yes, the U.S. may be propping up a dictator in Saudi Arabia right now, dictatorship. But what are the economic costs that are so fundamental to the U.S.-Saudi relationship and the costs that the U.S. really doesn't want to compromise, both security and economically?
Yes, I mean, let's be clear. Joe Biden's administration has its goals, its agendas, its priorities, and its interests in the Middle East. And Saudi Arabia factors into this quite a bit. The administration wants to wind down the war in Yemen, and that can't really be done if the administration is going to not work with Saudi Arabia. The Biden administration wants to push back against Iranian influence, like every administration has since 1979. And I think this is just a geopolitical calculation. The administration just thinks that sanctioning Mohammed bin Salman would undermine so many of Washington's perceived interests. There's just, realpolitik factors trumped justice in this case, and I think it's just that simple.
Indeed. George, I'm going to let you have the last word. Unfortunately, we're completely out of time for this edition of The Newsmakers. Thanks all so much for joining us, and we'll see you next time.